The morning I took over the clinic, I got there before the lights were warm. And that is how a man I had never met came to tell me not to touch a dog I had once held together with my own 2 hands. It was 0700 hours on a Tuesday in early autumn, and the treatment floor still smelled of the disinfectant the night crew ran before they locked up. I had signed for the keys the evening before, in a dim office with a colonel's aide who wanted to be home, and I had told no one on the day staff that I was coming in early. I wanted to see the place the way it actually ran, not the way a floor stands, when it knows an officer is watching. So I wore my working uniform, with the blouse still stiff from the plastic, and I crouched at a supply cart near the far wall, counting hemostats into a tray, and I let myself be nobody for a little while longer. The door at the end of the corridor opened with the particular scrape it would make every morning I worked there, a sound I would come to know like my own heartbeat. And a man came in with a dog on a short lead. He was young and broad through the shoulders in the way that men get when their fitness is a job and not a hobby. And he moved with the flat economy of someone who has spent years learning not to waste a single motion. The dog beside him was a Belgian Malinois, fawn going gray at the muzzle, and it walked with a hitch in its back end that I felt in my own chest before my mind had finished the thought. I did not turn all the way around. I keep my hands where a nervous dog can see them, always, and I kept them there now, low and open, and I watched the animal instead of the man. That is the first thing they teach you and the last thing you forget. You read the dog. "Ma'am," the man said, and there was a warning already loaded into the single word. "Don't pet him, he bites, he hates strangers." I straightened up slowly. I said, "Understood." I did not tell him that I had spent the better part of 2 decades being trusted by animals that had every reason to trust no one. I did not tell him anything at all. I looked at the dog, and the dog looked back at me, and I had the strange and specific sensation of being recognized before I had done anything worth recognizing. The Malinois had a surgical scar running along its left flank, a long pale seam under the short coat, healed clean and old. I knew the shape of it. I want to be careful about how I say that because it sounds like a thing a person tells themselves after the fact, and I have been a scientist long enough to distrust a tidy story. But I knew the shape of that scar, the way you know your own handwriting on an envelope you do not remember addressing. My stomach did something cold and slow. The dog leaned, just slightly, just a shift of weight against the pull of its own leash, its shoulder tilting a few degrees toward me across the 6 feet of tile that separated us. The man felt it through the lead and corrected without looking down, a small automatic tug, the way you square a picture on a wall as you pass it. "Sorry," he said, not sounding sorry, sounding like a man who apologizes in advance for a dog he loves and does not entirely trust in a room full of strangers. "He's a working dog, not a pet. People always want to touch him." "I understand," I said again. "He's beautiful." The man's jaw tightened at that, as if I had said something soft and useless, and he led the dog past me toward the exam rooms, and I stood there with a tray of hemostats in my hand, and my heart going far too hard for 0700 on a quiet Tuesday. I have learned over a long career to distrust the moment when a memory tries to hand you a coincidence. Animals do not appear in our lives to complete our stories. They are not symbols. They are muscle and appetite and fear and loyalty, and they owe us nothing. And the surest way to get a dog killed is to start believing it is a character in a narrative about you. So I stood there and I argued with myself. There are a great many Belgian Malinois in the working dog population. A great many of them are graying at the muzzle at this stage of their careers. A great many of them carry old surgical scars, because that is what it means to be a dog who has gone where these dogs go. A scar is not a fingerprint. I told myself all of that in the cold and orderly voice I use for hard cases, and it was all true, and it did not move the thing that had settled in my chest by so much as an inch. Because the dog had looked at me, not past me, the way an anxious animal scans a room full of strangers, cataloging exits and threats. At me. It had done the arithmetic that a dog does in the first half-second, the calculation that no amount of training ever fully overrides, and it had come up with an answer that its handler's certainty could not account for. I set the tray down before I could drop it, and I went to find the sergeant who ran the floor, and I did not let myself go and read that dog's file yet, because I was afraid of what the case number would tell me. My name is Rebecca Ashford, and on that particular morning, I was a major in the United States Army, 40 years old, a veterinarian by training, and a soldier by a decision I made in my late 20s that surprised everyone who knew me, including myself. I had reported to that installation the day before as the incoming officer in charge of its veterinary treatment facility, which is a plain way of saying that every military working dog on that post, and a good many of the horses and cats and reptiles that belong to the families who live there, had just become my responsibility. It is not a glamorous command. It does not come with a staff car or a salute from the gate. It comes with early mornings and hard phone calls and animals who cannot tell you where it hurts. And I had wanted it more than I have wanted almost anything. I grew up in rural Ohio, the daughter of a large animal veterinarian who worked out of the bed of a truck. My earliest memories are of my father's hands and of the way frightened animals grew quiet under them, and of the specific patience it takes to be trusted by something that outweighs you and is scared. I went to veterinary school because I could not imagine doing anything else. And I took my degree at 26, and then, to the bafflement of my professors, I raised my right hand and let the Army make me a captain. I could give you the noble version. The honest version is that I wanted my skill to matter in the places where it was hardest to practice, and there is nowhere harder to keep an animal alive than the far edge of a war. That first morning, before I had so much as changed the name on the office door, a sergeant first class named Tessa Holcomb found me at the desk with a stack of kennel charts open in front of me. She was the senior veterinary services non-commissioned officer on the floor, which meant she was the person who actually made the place work, and she stopped in the doorway with a cup of coffee halfway to her mouth and a look of dawning horror. "You're the new officer in charge," she said. It was not a question. She had seen the orders on the desk. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I would have met you at the gate. I would have had the floor squared away." "That's exactly why I didn't tell anyone," I said. "Sit down, Sergeant. Drink your coffee. I want to see the floor the way it really runs, not the way it stands when it thinks a major is coming." She sat, warily, and after a few minutes, she stopped treating me like an unexploded shell and started treating me like a colleague, which is all I have ever wanted from the people I work with. People do not understand what the Army Veterinary Corps is until they need it, and then they understand it completely and forever. We are a small branch, older than most people would guess, and we care for every working animal the Department of Defense owns, which in the modern era means, above all, the dogs. There are dogs who find explosives, and dogs who find people, and dogs who go through doors ahead of the men and women who love them. And every one of those dogs is a soldier who cannot read the risk it is taking, and someone has to keep them healthy enough to do the work and whole enough to come home from it. And that someone is us. We vaccinate the family cats too, and we inspect the food that feeds the whole installation, and we sign the health certificates that let a sergeant move a beagle across an ocean when the orders come. But the heart of the branch, the reason I stayed in a uniform when I could have made 3 times the money in a warm clinic in a quiet town, is the dogs. I had spent 13 years learning how to keep them alive in the places where keeping anything alive is a small act of defiance. And I had written a good part of the trauma protocol that the branch now uses to do it. And I had asked for this command specifically because a facility like this one is where the dogs come at the 2 ends of their service, the beginning and the end, and I wanted my hands on both. I should tell you that I am not, by nature, a person who announces herself. Some officers fill a room the moment they enter it, and it serves them well, and I have never once been able to do it. My father was the same. He could quiet a panicked horse in a dark barn, but at the church supper he stood by the wall and let other men talk. What I have, instead, is a kind of stubbornness that does not look like much from the outside. I do the work, and I do it correctly, and I keep doing it after the people who make speeches have gone home. And over a long enough time, the work speaks in a voice that is harder to argue with than any speech. It is not a fast way to earn respect. It has cost me, more than once, in rooms where the loudest voice won, and mine was not loud. But it is the only way I know how to be. And it has this one great advantage, which is that the respect it earns, when it finally comes, is real, and does not have to be defended. because it was never a performance in the first place. I carried a weight that morning that no one on the floor could have seen. Everyone carries something. That is not a special claim. But there are weights you set down at the end of the day, and weights you have built a whole life around not setting down, and mine was the second kind, and I had gotten so practiced at carrying it that I had almost forgotten it was there. I would be reminded in about 3 hours in a small exam room by a dog. Sergeant Holcomb had run this floor through 2 changes of command, and I could see in the first hour that she was the kind of non-commissioned officer who is the actual load-bearing wall of an organization while the officers come and go like weather. I told her so, more or less, and she pretended not to be pleased, and that was the beginning of the best working relationship I have ever had. We went through the day's schedule together. There were vaccinations and a lameness workup and a dental, and there was, at 1000 hours, an end-of-service medical evaluation for a Belgian Malinois, aging chronic hip and spine changes. Handler, a Navy Special Warfare Operator First Class named Delgado. An end-of-service evaluation is the paperwork name for the hardest conversation in my profession. It is what we do when a working dog's body has finished the work its heart still wants to do. Sometimes it ends in retirement and a soft bed in a good home. Sometimes it ends the other way. Either way, it is a morning that costs everyone in the room something. I pulled the dog's file. It was thin in the way that the files of dogs who have been passed from unit to unit and theater to theater are always thin. A patchwork of transfers and retransfers, and somewhere in the middle of it was a scanned field surgical note from years earlier, smudged, hurried, the ink of a work light and a bad night. It recorded a catastrophic abdominal and flank injury, a save against long odds, and the line where the surgeon's name should have been was blank. Lost in a transfer or never entered at all. I read the case number twice, and then I set the file down very carefully, as if it might come apart in my hands. I did not need the name on the file to tell me whose surgery it was. I had been trying not to know it since the door scraped open at 0700. In the spring of 2017, I was a captain, 31 years old, deployed to the eastern mountains of Afghanistan as a forward veterinary surgeon in support of a joint special operations task force. It is a strange and specific job. You are a doctor for soldiers who have 4 legs and cannot consent, and you love them the way their handlers love them, which is to say, completely and against your own better judgment. The task force ran working dogs on its patrols, and I ran a small surgical setup a long way forward, closer to the fighting than a veterinarian is supposed to be, because that is where the dogs were, and that is where they got hurt. There was a route clearance patrol that spring that walked into a buried charge. I was not there when it happened. I was there for the after, which is the part they do not put in the recruiting materials. The blast killed a handler, a petty officer first class named Gabriel Stroud, a serious young man with a photograph of a lake taped inside his helmet, and it very nearly killed his dog. They brought the dog to me at a dead run. 4 men and a litter and a corpsman with his hands pressed into a wound that was trying to empty the animal onto the ground. A Malinois with its flank opened and its belly full of things that belong on the inside, and I did the only thing I have ever known how to do. I put my hands in, and I did not take them out for a long time. I had met Gabriel Stroud in the way you meet people in those places, glancingly and completely at the same time. He had brought the dog to me twice before, once for a torn pad, and once because he was worried about the animal in a way he could not name, which is the kind of visit the good handlers make, and the careless ones never do. He had shown me the photograph in his helmet, unprompted, the way a lonely young man will. A lake in the early morning, flat as glass, a dock, a canoe pulled up on a gravel shore. He said it was where he was going to take the dog when they both got out. He said it the way people say things they have decided to believe, because the alternative is unbearable. And then a piece of buried metal in a mountain road decided otherwise, and there was no lake and no getting out. And there was only a table in a plywood room and my hands and a dog that would not stop bleeding. I did not know, working over the animal that night, that its handler was already gone. They did not tell me until it was over, because they are not fools, and they knew that a surgeon who is grieving is a surgeon who makes mistakes, and they needed me clean. So I fought for the dog without knowing that the dog was all that was left. Which is, I have come to think, its own kind of mercy. though it did not feel like one when they finally told me. We lost the light twice that night. The generator stuttered, and a corpsman held a headlamp over my hands and counted the sutures out loud so that I would not lose one in the dark, and I improvised closures that no textbook would sign off on, because the textbook assumes a clean table and a full bank of blood and a morning that is coming. The dog took 11 units before the bleeding slowed. I remember telling it to stay with me. I remember saying out loud to an animal under anesthesia who could not hear me, "You do not get to quit on me too." I had already lost the handler. I was not built to lose them both. There was a moment near the end of that surgery that I have never told anyone about, and I am not sure why I am telling you now, except that the dog has made me honest again. Somewhere around 2 a.m, with the bleeding finally slowing and the animal's heart holding, I put my forehead down against the edge of the table, just for a second, because I was more tired than I had ever been in my life. And I said a few words that were not a prayer exactly, because I am not a person who prays, but were as close as I come to one. I asked the dog to live, not for the mission, and not for the army, and not even for itself. I asked it to live for the man it had come in with, whom I did not yet know was gone, because it seemed to me in my exhaustion that if I could keep this one piece of him breathing, then the night would not have taken everything. I did not know, when I said it, that I was already too late for the part I was bargaining for, but the dog lived, and I have come to believe that the bargain held anyway, just on a longer schedule than I understood at the time. The dog lived. I closed that long seam on its flank under a headlamp at something like 3 a.m, and it lived, and at first light it was evacuated to a larger facility to the rear, and I never saw it again. That is how it works forward. You save the thing in front of you, and it is carried away to the next set of hands, and you turn around and there is another thing in front of you, and you do not get to follow the story to its end. I did not know the dog's name. I did not know where it went. When my rotation ended, I came home, and the war closed behind me like water, and I built a life on top of it and did not look down. I carried Gabriel Stroud for 9 years. I carried him the way you carry the ones you could not save, in a sealed place that you learn not to open, because opening it feels like losing them again. I went to the wall where his name is cut into the stone more than once, and I stood there and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not break something I needed to keep whole. But in 9 years of carrying his memory, of visiting his name, of turning his lake photograph over in my mind, I had never once thought to ask what had become of his dog. It had not occurred to me that the dog might still be alive. It had not occurred to me that the dog might be walking, gray at the muzzle and hitching at the hip, into a clinic I had just been given command of, on a Tuesday at 1000 hours, for the evaluation that decides how a good dog's story ends. At 1000 hours, I walked into the exam room, and Petty Officer Delgado was already there, and so was the dog, and so was the whole weight of a morning I had not seen coming. He had the dog on the table, or was trying to, one hand on its collar and the other reaching for a muzzle, and he was talking to it low and steady in the way of a man who has done this 1,000 times and hates every version of it. When I came in, he did not look up. He had decided already what I was: support staff, or a lost officer, or a woman who would make cooing noises and get bitten and make his morning harder. "I've got him," he said. "You don't need to be in here for the intake. He's not friendly with people he doesn't know, and he's having a bad day. No offense." "None taken," I said. Sergeant Holcomb had followed me in and was setting up at the counter, and I saw her glance at me, and I gave her the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. I did not go to the dog. I stood a careful distance away by the door, and I let the animal decide what it wanted to do, which is the only thing you can ever really let a working dog do. And the dog, who was old and sore and having, as its handler had accurately said, a very bad day, lifted its head off the table and looked at me across the room, and then it did the thing that no part of its training and no part of Delgado's certainty had prepared either of them for. It got down off the table, it crossed the floor, and it pressed the flat bone of its skull into my leg, hard, the whole graying weight of it leaning into me, and then it lowered itself to the tile at my feet and let out a long breath, and it settled, in the specific posture a working dog holds only for a person it has, somewhere in the unreachable machinery of its memory, decided is safe. The room went very still. "That's," Delgado said, and stopped. He was staring at his dog on the floor at my feet. "That's not," He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that for anyone. He doesn't even do that for me on a good day. I put my hand down slowly, and the dog turned its head and pushed its nose into my palm, and I felt the old animal shaking very slightly, the way they do when something too big for them is happening, and I was not in much better shape myself. There is a smell that comes off a dog's coat, warm and specific, that I have never been able to describe to anyone who has not spent a life with their hands in it. And it came up off this one, and it undid me quietly. Because a body remembers what a mind has sealed away, and my hands knew this animal before I would let myself say so. Behind me, I heard Sergeant Holcomb set down her clipboard and, very quietly, open the file drawer where the transferred surgical records lived. She had caught up to something a beat behind the dog. She was reading the room the way I read animals, and what she was reading was a case number on a schedule, a blank surgeon's line on an old field note, and the face of an incoming officer who had gone the color of the tile. She was too good at her job to say any of it out loud in front of the handler. She simply pulled the two files and held them against her chest and waited, and I was grateful for her in a way I did not have the room to express just then. Delgado, meanwhile, was watching his dog the way you watch a person you love do something entirely out of character, with the specific fear of a man who has just been shown that there is a room inside someone he thought he knew all the way through. "He was hit before I got him," he said, half to me and half to the animal. He came to me with the scar and the limp and a file with holes in it. I always figured whoever fixed him up was gone. You always figure they're gone. Delgado came around the table. All the flat economy had gone out of him. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had changed, gone younger and off balance. "Who are you?" The dog remembered a thing my paperwork had lost, and now the room was hurrying to catch up to the dog. I did not answer him yet. I knelt down instead, on the tile, in my stiff new uniform, and I put both hands on the old Malinois and felt along its flank, under the short coat, until my fingers found the long, pale seam I had closed under a headlamp 9 years and half a world away. And I let myself finally know it all the way through. Here's a thing I have learned about people who are very good at hard jobs. When you take away the ground they are standing on, they do not always fall gracefully. Sometimes they come up swinging because motion feels better than the thing that just happened to them. Delgado came up swinging. "I don't know what that was," he said, and the warmth that had cracked open in his voice a moment before had frozen over again. Harder now, defensive. "I don't know what you did. Some kind of, I don't know, treat in your pocket, a scent, something. But this is my dog. This is my evaluation to sit for. And with respect, ma'am, I came here to get this done, not to watch a stranger do a party trick with an animal that has been through enough." "There's no treat in my pocket," I said, still kneeling, still with my hand on the dog. "There's no trick." "Then I don't want to hear about it," he said. "I've had him for 6 years. I did 2 more workups and a deployment with him after that. I know what he does and does not do, and I am telling you he does not do that, and I do not need this today. Can we please just get the evaluation over with?" I understood him better than he wanted to be understood. He had come in that morning to do the worst part of loving a working dog, which is to sit at the table where you find out how much road is left, and he had braced himself for it the way you brace for a blow, and then a stranger had walked in, and his dog had walked away from him and chosen her, and it had knocked the brace out from under him at the exact moment he needed it most. Of course he was angry. Anger was the only handhold in the room that would hold his weight. I have watched a great many people meet the end of a working dog service, and grief does not have good manners. It comes out sideways. It comes out as anger at the veterinarian, at the paperwork, at the young technician who says the wrong gentle thing, at the dog itself for the crime of getting old. I have been the target of it more times than I can count, and I learned early that you do not take it personally, because it is not personal. It is a man standing at the edge of a loss, and swinging at the nearest solid object so that he does not have to feel the ground give way. Delgado was swinging at me. That was fine. I have broad shoulders and a low center of gravity, and I did not need him to be gentle with me. I needed him to still be standing when the morning was over. "Ma'am, with respect," he said again, and the phrase had become a wall he was building between us, brick by brick. "I have handled this dog through things you would not believe. I know him. I do not know you. And I do not have it in me today to be managed by a stranger who has a way with animals. So please." He was not shouting. That was almost the worst of it. He was holding his voice flat and level with an effort I could see, because he was a disciplined man having the worst kind of morning, and the discipline was the only thing keeping him in one piece. Sergeant Holcomb had the field surgical record in her hand now, and the incoming officer in charge's file beside it, and she was looking at me with a question all over her face. She could end his confusion in a sentence. She could say, "This is Major Ashford. She runs this facility now, and by the way, her name is the one missing off the bottom of that surgical note." She was waiting for me to nod. I did not nod. I outranked every single assumption Shane Delgado had made about me since the door scraped open at 0700. I outranked him by a wide margin, in fact, and I could have said so, and the saying of it would have been true and clean and satisfying and exactly the wrong thing. Rank was not what the morning needed. A man was standing over the last living piece of a friendship he was about to have to let go of, and he was frightened, and frightened people do not need to be corrected. They need to be given a way to put their weight down. "Sergeant," I said quietly without turning around. "Hold the record. Not yet." Holcomb's eyebrows went up, but she slid the file back into the drawer. "Let the dog have the room," I said. "We have time." Delgado looked at me like I had said something in a language he did not speak. On the floor between us, the old Malinois sighed and stretched one gray paw across the toe of my boot and closed its eyes, and for the length of one long breath, none of us said anything at all. I have spent my life around creatures that cannot lie, and it has ruined me a little for the human habit of managing the truth. So I made a decision, kneeling on that tile floor, and it was not a hard one once I saw it clearly. I would tell Petty Officer Delgado the truth, but I would not tell it to win. I would not play my rank across the table like a card that ends the hand. I would give him the one thing that would let him understand what he was looking at, and I would give it to him gently on the dog's terms, and I would pay for it with the grief I had kept sealed for 9 years, because that was the honest price, and it was time I paid it. "Petty Officer Delgado," I said, "I am going to tell you something, and I need you to just listen to it. Not to argue with it, just to hear it." Something in my voice reached him. He stopped shifting his weight. He said, "Okay." "This dog has a scar," I said. "It runs along his left flank, about 9 inches, low, curving up toward the last rib. You can feel it under the coat. It is an old surgical closure, and it was done fast, in the field, under bad light. Yeah," he said slowly. "He came to me with that. It's from before. He got hit, before my time. Nobody could ever tell me the whole story of it." "He took 11 units before the bleeding slowed," I said. "We lost the light twice. The generator was failing, and a corpsman held a headlamp over my hands, and he read the sutures out loud, one at a time, so that I would not lose count in the dark. I closed that flank under that headlamp at around 3 in the morning. I improvised 2 of the closures because there was no clean way to do it right, and I have wondered ever since whether they held. Looking at how he moves, I would say they held. I could have stopped there. It would have been enough to make the point, and a smaller person, or a more frightened one, might have let it sit there as a kind of victory. The surgeon revealed, the doubter silenced. But I have never once in my life found that being proven right is worth as much as people think it is. And there was a young man in front of me who was about to understand that he had been standing in the presence of the person who gave him 9 years with the animal he loved. And I did not want him to receive that as a rebuke. I wanted him to receive it as a gift, because that is what it was, to both of us. So I kept my voice low, and I kept my hands on the dog, and I told him the rest of it, the part that was not about the surgery at all. "I need you to understand something, Petty Officer," I said. "I did not come in here this morning to prove anything to you. I did not know he was your dog. I did not know he was anyone's dog. I closed that wound 9 years ago, and I handed him off to the evacuation crew at first light, and I walked back into a plywood room and washed the blood off my arms, and I never learned his name or where he went. I have thought about him maybe twice in 9 years, and both times I made myself stop because I could not think about the dog without thinking about the man, and I could not think about the man at all. My throat was doing something I could not entirely control. So this is not a party trick. This is the first time in 9 years that I have been allowed to know that the night was not a total loss. You gave me that by walking him through that door. I would have chosen to be gentle about it regardless. But I want you to know that we are, the 2 of us, standing on the same ground here. Delgado had gone completely still. The color had gone out of his face and then come back wrong. He looked at the dog and then at my hands, which were resting on the animal's side, and then at my face. And I watched a story he had been told secondhand. A story that had always had a hole in the middle of it, where a name should be, close around the woman kneeling in front of him. You, he said. That was you, the surgeon, the one nobody could ever name. His handler was a petty officer first class named Gabriel Stroud, I said, and it was the first time in 9 years I had said the name out loud to another living person, and it cost exactly what I had known it would cost. My voice held, but only just. He did not survive the blast. I never got to save him. I only got to save the part of him that had 4 legs, and then they carried the dog away to the rear at first light, and I did not know what became of him. I did not even know his name. I have carried Gabriel Stroud for 9 years, petty officer. I visit his name on the wall. And in all that time it never once crossed my mind that the dog might still be walking around in the world. I looked down at the gray muzzle across my boot. His name, I said, is on a wall I visit, and this dog is the last of him that is still breathing. I do not know how long we would have stayed like that, the 3 of us and the dog, suspended in the middle of a thing too large for the small tiled room, because the door scraped open and the world came in with it. Colonel Peter Vale was the regional veterinary commander, an 06 with 30 years of animals and soldiers behind him, and no patience at all for ceremony. And he had come by that morning, as he told me later, simply to shake the hand of his new officer in charge before the day ran away with them both. He stopped in the doorway and took in the room, the way senior people do, in one flat sweep, and whatever he saw in it made him decide to make it formal. Floor, he said, not loudly. And Sergeant Holcomb came to attention, and after a half-second, Delgado did too, out of the deep reflex that the service builds into your spine. I got up off the tile. Major Ashford, Colonel Vale said, I am sorry I did not catch you yesterday. I wanted to be here for your first day proper, but the day had other ideas. He looked around the room, at the 2 enlisted service members and the old dog. I see you have already found the work. Yes, sir, I said. I have. Petty officer, the colonel said, turning to Delgado, who was looking at him with the careful blankness of a man who has lost track of how much he does not know. Do you know who you have got standing in front of you? This is Major Rebecca Ashford. She is your new officer in charge, and she is one of the reasons the dogs in this command come home at all. Half the far-forward trauma protocol we run on working dogs, she wrote. The other half she field-tested with her own 2 hands in places I will not name in a clinic. You could not ask for better hands on that animal, and from the look on your face I would guess you are only now finding that out. Delgado said, I am, sir. I am finding that out. Colonel Vale was not a sentimental man, and he did not linger on the moment, because he had learned somewhere in his 30 years that the kindest thing you can do with a truth this large is to state it plainly, and then let the people in the room have the space to absorb it without an audience. He asked me 2 or 3 quick questions about the facility, professional questions, the kind an incoming commander should be able to answer on her first morning, and I answered them, and I watched Delgado watch me answer them, watched him revise, in real time, every assumption he had built since 0700. The woman he had told to keep her hands off his dog was fielding a colonel's questions about trauma, logistics without a pause, and the dog, he had said, did not do that for anyone, was asleep against her boot, and the field note that had haunted the edges of his dog's whole history had just filled in its missing name, and the name was hers. I will let you get back to it, the colonel said. Major, welcome aboard. Petty officer, that is a good dog, and he is in the best possible hands, and I'm sorry for what it costs to bring him in for this. Carry on. And he was gone, as abruptly as he had come, the way the good ones are, leaving the room to the people who actually had to live in it. Sergeant Holcomb had the file out again, and this time I let her. She had already, in the quiet way of the truly competent, corrected the record. She had entered the surgeon of record on that old field note, matched to the case number from the incoming officer's own service history. Ashford, Rebecca, Captain, 2017. She turned the screen so that Delgado could see it, and he read it, and he came, slowly, to attention a second time, though no one had called for it. He was not standing at attention for the oak leaf on my collar. I have been saluted for the rank, and I know the difference. He was standing at attention for the dog. He had told me not to touch his dog, I would think later, turning the morning over. And now he could not look away from my hands. You are the reason, Delgado said. He was not asking. His voice was rough. You are the reason I got 9 years with him. I did not correct that either, though it was not the whole truth, and he would come to understand why. I only said, he is a very good dog, petty officer. He was a very good dog on the worst night of his life, and he stayed one. That is not my doing. That is his. The thing about a reckoning is that it does not actually change the reason everyone came into the room. Once the truth was on the table between us, plain and named at last, the dog on the floor was still an old dog, and the evaluation I had come in to oversee still had to happen, and no amount of recognition was going to give that animal back the years its body had spent. Delgado apologized. He did it the way a good man does it, plainly, without a single excuse braided in. Ma'am, he said, I was out of line. From the second I walked in, I told an officer not to touch a dog, and the officer turned out to be the one person alive who has more right to touch that dog than I do. I am sorry. You do not owe me the apology, I said, and I meant it. Do you want to know the truth of it? You gave that dog 9 years I had nothing to do with. I closed a wound and handed him to the next set of hands and walked away and never knew his name. You are the one who did the deployments with him. You are the one who read his moods and pulled him back from the edge of whatever handlers pull these dogs back from. You kept him alive 9 years past, the morning I signed him back into the world. If we are handing out credit in this room, most of it is yours. That was your surgery, petty officer. It just took longer than mine. He had to look away when I said that, at the wall, at the middle distance, at anything but the dog or me, and I let him have it. There is a courtesy you owe a man when you have just handed him more than he can carry all at once. And part of that courtesy is not watching his face while he decides whether he is going to be able to hold it. I busied my hands with the dog. I checked the old seam again, ran my fingers along the hips, felt the places where the years had settled into the joints, and I gave Shane Delgado 30 seconds of not being looked at, which is sometimes the most generous thing one person can give another. When he had his voice back, he asked the question that handlers always ask, the real one, underneath all the others. How long? He said. Honest, not the paperwork answer. How long does he have? Honest, I said. With the right management, longer than you are afraid of right now. His hips are bad and his spine is worse, and he is not going to chase anything down again. But he is not in the kind of pain that ends a life. He is in the kind of pain we can carry for him. If you want the plain version, this is not the morning you say goodbye to him. This is the morning you retire him. There's a difference, and I will make sure the difference is a real one and not a kindness I am telling you to make you feel better. He nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders came down about an inch, the first of many inches that would come down over the following weeks. We spent the next while doing the unglamorous concrete work that is the truest form of care I know. We went through the medication, the anti-inflammatories, and the joint support, and the schedule that would keep the old dog comfortable without dulling him into a stranger. We talked about the bed he would need, orthopedic, low to the ground, out of the draft. We talked about the ramp for the 2 steps up to Delgado's porch, and about keeping his weight down so the hips had less to carry, and about the walks, shorter now, slower, but still every day, because a working dog that stops moving entirely gives up something more important than muscle. I wrote it all out for him in my own hand, because I have found that a plan a person can hold is worth more than the best advice spoken into the air. And I watched him fold the paper and put it in his breast pocket and pat it once, the way you check for a thing that matters. It struck me, doing it, that this was the same work at both ends. 9 years earlier, I had fought to give this animal a future with my hands in its chest under a failing light. Now I was fighting to give it a good end with a medication schedule and a porch ramp, and it was the same fight, only quieter, and it asked the same thing of me that the surgery had, which was to refuse to look away from a living creature that needed me and to keep my hands steady while I did what the moment required. People think the dramatic part is the hard part. It is not. The hard part is the long, ordinary care that comes after, the part with no headlamp and no story in it, the part that is only love with its sleeves rolled up. Delgado had done 9 years of that hard part. I intended to help him do the last of it well. Then we went to work, because that is the mercy in my profession, that there is always work, and the work is a way to love the animal when the words run out. We did the evaluation honestly. We did not rush it, and we did not pretend. We talked about the hips and the spine and the way the dog carried its weight. And we talked in the plain language I make myself use, because the families and the handlers deserve the plain language, about pain and about time, and about the difference between a life worth living and a life merely continued. And the answer, that morning, was a good one. Not a fast euthanasia. Not yet, and not for a while. The dog had road left, real road, with the right management, and it had earned a soft place to spend it. By the time we were finished, the small room had filled up, the way those rooms do with the people who care for these animals, a couple of the day shift technicians, another handler who had heard something in the hallway. There's a thing that happens in a veterinary treatment facility that I have never seen happen anywhere else in the Army. The whole enterprise runs on people who chose, deliberately, to spend their service caring for creatures that cannot thank them, and it selects over time for a particular kind of person, gentle and stubborn and unimpressed by rank when there is an animal on the table. When one of them is having a hard morning with a good dog, the others drift in, quietly, without being called, and they stand at the edges of the room and they make the space larger by being in it. One of the young technicians, a specialist who could not have been more than 20, had heard the whole story in the way that stories move through a small floor, and she stood by the counter with her eyes bright and did not say anything. And when the old dog shifted, she was the first to kneel and steady it, and I saw in her the whole future of the branch, and it was in good hands. The other handler, an army sergeant with a young dog of his own, still in its prime, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw working, because every handler in that room was looking at Delgado's old Malinois and seeing the morning that was coming for them, and there is a fellowship in that knowledge that does not need words. They closed ranks around the two of us without being asked, the way that people who do this work close ranks, and somewhere in the middle of the talking, the old Malinois fell asleep on the floor between Delgado and me, its head on my boot and its spine against his knee, breathing slow and deep and untroubled, the way a creature breathes only when it has decided that it is, for the moment, entirely safe. I stayed late that first night, long after the floor had gone quiet and the day staff had gone home, and I sat in the office that was now mine, with the light off and the door open, and I let the grief I had reopened move through me instead of sealing it back up. For 9 years I had kept Gabriel Stroud in a locked place, because opening the lock felt like losing him a second time. That is the bargain you make with that kind of grief, and it is a bad bargain, though it takes a long time to see it. You think you are protecting the memory by refusing to touch it, and what you are actually doing is refusing to let the person be a person, keeping them frozen at the worst moment instead of letting them be all the moments. The dog had picked the lock without asking me. It had crossed a tiled floor and leaned its whole gray weight into my leg and opened a room I had kept shut for 9 years. And when I finally went into the room, I found that Gabriel Stroud was still there. Not just the blast and the loss of him, but the whole of him. The lake taped in his helmet, and the serious young face, and the dog he had loved, waiting to be spoken about out loud. So I did the thing I had never done. I wrote a letter to his family. I told them who I was and what I had done for his dog on the worst night of all our lives. I told them that the dog had lived, that it had served 9 more years, that it was old now and gray and safe, and that it had walked into my clinic on a Tuesday morning and remembered me before I had said a word, and that in remembering me, it had let me finally grieve their son the way he deserved to be grieved, which is to say, completely, and out loud and without the lock. I told them that their son had loved a good animal, and that the animal had carried a piece of him through 9 more years of the world, and that I was sorry it had taken me so long to say any of it. It is a strange thing, to be given back a grief you thought you had managed. It does not feel like a burden lifting. It feels at first like a burden arriving. I had spent 9 years being right about how to survive Gabriel Stroud, and being right had not made me whole. There is a difference between the two that I had let myself forget. You can be entirely correct about how to carry a loss and still be carrying it all wrong. The letter took me most of the night. I am not a writer, and I threw away 3 beginnings before I found the one that did not lie. The trouble with a letter like that is the temptation to make it comfortable, to round the corners, to give the family a version of the night that they can set on a shelf and not have to look at. But they had lost a son, and they deserved the truth of him, and the truth of him was that he had been a serious young man who loved a dog and a lake he never got to bring the dog to. And that on the worst night of my life, his dog had bled out onto my hands, and I had refused to let it go, partly for the dog's sake, and partly, I understood now, for his. I told them all of it. I told them the dog's name and its age, and that it slept, that very night, in a good home. I told them that their son's dog had walked into my clinic 9 years later and known me across a room, and that in knowing me, it had given me back the ability to grieve their son out loud, and that I was ashamed of how long that had taken, and grateful past saying that it had come at all. I thought, while I wrote it, about the word closure, which people use about grief as if it were a door you get to shut. It is not a door you shut. If you are lucky, it is a door you finally get to leave open so that the person can come and go in your memory the way the living come and go, instead of standing sealed behind it, forever, in the single worst moment. The dog had not given me closure. The dog had given me the opposite, and the opposite was what I had needed all along. Delgado and I built the retirement plan for the dog over the next hour on the phone, the two of us, the handler and the surgeon, working out the medication and the schedule and the soft bed and the good road ahead. And when I finally signed the letter to Stroud's family and sealed it and set it in the tray to go out in the morning, I found that I was tired in a way I had not been in years, a clean tired, a tired that has an end to it. And I went home and I slept all the way through, for the first time in longer than I want to admit. The dog retired 3 weeks later, formally, with all the paperwork the service requires to hand a working animal into the keeping of the person it loves. Shane Delgado adopted him. There was never any question that he would. And when the certificate came to my desk for signature, Delgado asked me for something I had not expected. "Ma'am," he said. He had taken to coming by the clinic on the excuse of the dog's care and then, after a while, without the excuse. "There's a line on the retirement certificate for the veterinarian of record. I'd like it to be you. It's your name on the surgery that started him. It ought to be your name on the papers that let him go home. Same hands at both ends." I signed it. I do not mind telling you that my own hand was not entirely steady when I did. Delgado and I became friends, which is not a word I use loosely, and which I would have found difficult to believe on the morning he told me to keep my hands off his dog. He came by the clinic, at first with the transparent excuse of the dog's medication schedule, and then with thinner excuses, and then with no excuse at all, and we would stand at the kennel runs in the evening and talk. He told me about the deployments he had done with the dog, the doors it had gone through ahead of him, the night in a mountain village when it had put its body between him and a thing in the dark and been right to. I told him a little, not much, about the plywood room and the headlamp and the corpsman who counted. We were 2 people who had each held a different end of the same animal's life. And it turned out there was a great deal to say about that, and a great deal that did not need saying at all. Gabriel Stroud's family wrote me back. I had half expected silence, because silence is a fair answer to a letter that arrives 9 years late. But they wrote back, a long letter in a mother's careful hand, and in it she thanked me, and she asked me questions about the dog, and she asked whether she might, someday, when she felt able, come and meet him. The lake in the photograph, she told me, was real. It was behind the house where Gabriel grew up. She said that when the dog was ready, and when she was ready, she would like to bring him there, so that at least the dog could stand on the gravel shore her son had promised it. I read that part of the letter standing in my office, and I had to sit down. I have thought a good deal since that morning about what it is that people are actually protecting when they tell you to stand back from a thing. Delgado had not been cruel that first morning. He had been afraid, and he had been protecting a dog he loved from a world of strangers, and he had made, in his fear, an entirely reasonable and entirely wrong assumption about the woman near his dog. It cost him nothing in the end, because the dog corrected him and because I chose not to make him pay for a mistake that fear had made on his behalf. But it might have gone another way. I could have played my rank across the table in the first 10 minutes and been right and been cold, and I would have won the room and lost the morning, and the dog would still have been old, and the grief would still have been sealed, and none of the good things would have happened. I have been underestimated many times in my career, and I want to be honest about how it feels, because I think people who give the advice about it are usually people who have not had to take it. It feels bad. It does not matter how secure you are in what you can do. When someone looks at you and decides in half a second that you are not the person who could possibly be in charge here, that you are the help, the wife, the lost civilian, the woman who will get bitten, there's a small hot thing that rises in your chest, and it wants very badly to be satisfied, to produce the credential, to watch the face change. I have felt that hot thing 1,000 times. What I have learned, slowly, and at the cost of the times I got it wrong, is that satisfying it is almost always a trade of something large for something small. You get the momentary pleasure of being proven right, and you give up the chance to be understood, which is a much rarer and better thing. The morning with the dog taught me that lesson more completely than any morning before it. If I had reached for the credential, I would have gotten a correct and empty little victory over a frightened man. Because I did not, I got a friend, and a grief finally set down, and a family's forgiveness, and an old dog thumping its tail on the grass. I would not trade a single one of those for the pleasure of watching Shane Delgado's face change 1 minute sooner than it did. The old Malinois lives at Delgado's house now, in a good yard with a soft bed and a schedule of medication I helped set. I go by, sometimes more than a veterinarian strictly needs to. The dog knows the sound of my truck. On the evening I am thinking of, I walked across the yard toward the porch where Delgado stood, and the old dog lifted its gray head from the grass and watched me come, and it thumped its tail once against the ground, unhurried, certain, the way a creature greets not a stranger and not even a friend exactly, but someone it has known all the way down, in the place under memory where the important things are kept. And Gabriel Stroud's family wrote me back, and the door I had kept shut for 9 years stayed open, and stayed a door instead of a wall. I want to say one thing to you, whoever you are, before I go. If you have ever been standing in the middle of the exact thing you have given your life to, and someone who does not know you has told you to step back, to keep your hands off, to leave it to the people who matter, I know how that lands. I know the particular sting of being made small in the one room where your competence should have been the safest assumption in the world. And I want to tell you that you do not have to correct every small man in every doorway. You do not have to win the moment. The truth about who you are does not depend on their permission to exist, and it has a way of surfacing on its own, in its own time, sometimes from the most unexpected direction. Sometimes it walks across the room on 4 legs and settles the whole question without a single word from you. And if you are carrying a grief you sealed up years ago because opening it felt like losing someone twice, I want to tell you the other thing the dog taught me. The lock is not protecting them. It is protecting you, and not even well. The people we love are not just the worst moment we lost them in. They are all the moments, and they are waiting, in the sealed room, to be let out and spoken about and grieved in the daylight. Let something pick the lock. Let it be a friend or a letter, or an old dog with a gray muzzle who remembers you before you have said a word. You will find, as I did, that being right about how you survived a thing is not the same as being whole, and that it is never too late to trade the one for the other. I did not expect, at 40 years old, to be taught anything fundamental by a Tuesday morning and an animal I had last seen bleeding on a table half a world away. I thought I had learned the things a person learns. I thought grief was a thing I had filed correctly and competence was a thing I no longer needed to prove, and the war was a door I had shut behind me for good. I was wrong about all 3, and I am glad I was wrong, and I have noticed that the important lessons almost always arrive this way, late and sideways, and disguised as an interruption to a morning you thought you had planned. Pay attention to the interruptions. Pay attention to the animal that will not stop looking at you, and to the person who has decided too quickly who you are, and to the sealed room you walk past every day and never enter. That is usually where the actual life is, waiting. I keep the hemostats counted and the floor honest and the dogs coming home. And on the good evenings, I drive out to a yard on the edge of the post, and an old soldier with 4 legs thumps his tail against the grass. And a young man who once told me not to touch his dog hands me a cold drink and sits down beside me, and we watch the light go, the 2 of us and the last living piece of a friend I finally learned how to grieve. The end.